I I think I'm laughing because I think one of the first experiences I had overseas, or one of the revelations that I had was that while I spoke a universal, English as a language we're very fortunate as Australian travellers to be able to communicate with so many people. But you realise pretty quickly that people don't always understand Australians.
Architects Abroad, a podcast brought to you by Brickworks Building Products.
G'day, I'm Tim Ross and welcome to Architects Abroad, a podcast for Brickworks Building Products. Travelling overseas is deeply embedded in the Australian psyche, and because of our relative isolation, we're drawn to exploring the world. We all know about the formative power of backpacking, but what about the vocational value of working overseas? What are the gains, both personal and professional, from time spent working abroad? In this podcast series, I talk to some of the best architects in the country to hear about their experience working overseas and how it has shaped them and their practice. In this episode, I chat to Asher Galvin, a practice director at BVN. In this wonderful chat, we hear about his early adventures studying overseas and then springboard into more recent times with his work in Thailand working on the new embassy. Once again, we hear about how jumping into the deep end always has its rewards. I know you're going to love this chat with Asher Galvin. Let's do This Is Your Life. Asher, good to see you. Thanks for laughing.
Thanks, Tim.
On the This Is Your Life line. Does it feel like that? This is good because this series of podcasts I've been making for Brickworks most have been on Skype or on the phone line. But you've popped up to my house.
Got the tour.
I've given you a glass of water, which, it means that we can have a normal conversation. Not that I'm not having a normal conversation down a phone line, but, sometimes I could be checking while someone's talking about their career, I could be checking my Instagram, but no.
The temptation is really, it's hard to ignore sometimes, isn't it?
Well, we're face to face in this situation, so there'll be no checking of the Instagram. The reason you're here is to talk about what happens to you professionally when you study or work overseas as an architect. And this discussion, I suppose, starts with you talking a bit about your desire to travel full stop. Why is that? I mean, obviously it's a part of who we are, isn't it? We're great travellers. Was it always something you thought you would do?
Yeah, I come from a family of travellers. My parents travelled extensively when they were young. I think they thought that they would be childless nomads their entire lives.
Yeah, right.
Reality bit pretty hard when they ended up having their first child. But they travelled a lot, and the reflection when I was a child on their photos and the slides that I would always want to drag out of a box and lose interest in as soon as they were projected.
But the idea of the magic was a magic different world, where somewhere that you weren't part of, but there was somewhere your parents had been before.
Yeah, I mean, I remember looking through those, those slides and seeing the sort of the whiteness of European or Northern American winters. It just seemed really magical, and the otherness was always an intrigue.
What about growing up in Perth? Is there a sense that you need to see more because of the isolation?
I think so. I think as having an exposure to architecture, as you do have a sense of other things being out there, but it's also an Australian rite of passage, isn't it? That is, I think it's done in a fairly methodical kind of way. Everyone finishes university or takes a year off and travels. But that maybe I was on that train, but I hopped off and took some detours.
You found yourself studying in Denmark. How did that happen?
This was probably after a period of about 2 years of being away from Australia. I was coming down to the end of my, the money bank was almost empty, and I'd been staying with a friend in Sweden for about a month. It was over the summer, the midsummer's period, which was so magical, and so after being in Stockholm for some time, moved to Copenhagen as the next destination, and was just struck by the just what a wonderful city it was. Stockholm, I think, is very, very romantic, but Copenhagen has a sense of, there's a sense of place and style and poise that is really attractive, and it really was shown not just through its great buildings or its old buildings, but I felt by the sort of the ordinary, or the 60s and 70s and 80s buildings that weren't spectacular, but they were well put together, and they held the city together in a way that didn't leave a patchwork. There was a real continuity to it.
It's an easy city to fit into, isn't it?
It is.
Like you can just sort of, it's a way of life here. Okay, this is nice. Okay.
Yeah, there's a real village vibe.
There's an ease with it. And so you fell in love with the place, and what happened?
I did. I basically immediately thought, wondered how I'd stay here for longer, and found the universities that were possible, that were available, and the Kunstakademiet in Copenhagen offered a guest student program at the time that was not necessarily directed towards architects, but to anyone. It really showed again, their open-mindedness to, and their willingness to be, expansive and share what they had. So that required an application and basically a proposal for a thesis. And I think I was through 3 years of architecture at the time. So I put that together. I met with some people and then ended up, in the time in between, returning to Perth because I'd done my dough, and was really excited a few months later to receive an invitation to study, and it was for up to 2 years. I could have stayed there. I chose to stay for one, but with no costs and just some open hands. It was really, really fantastic.
And what do you think you gained from that in terms of, from a work point of view? What inspired you? How would you describe how its influence on your life?
I think as an experience, what was maybe the most enlightening as a young student who had a huge admiration for the other and the unknown was that what we did in Australia and how we learnt and what we could do was equal to what was being done elsewhere. I felt that there were great students and there were ordinary students, and as there are in many places. What the greatest opportunity was to, I think, was to be independent, number one, and number two, to be surrounded by inspirational spaces and the sort of the layering of a city that has an age that at least from a European perspective is very old and very nuanced.
And returning to Perth after that, what was that like?
I don't remember it being a bad thing. I think that I had set my sights on leaving as soon as I'd finished. But it was a journey that I took returning through Sydney, and so I was working with James Gross at BVN on my way home, and then I had fixated on leaving at the time. That was my, the destination was out of Perth once I finished, but of course, best laid plans. And I got some guidance from my thesis professor who really encouraged me to stay in Perth. And he used the word critical mass a lot in terms of the understanding and recognizing the opportunities, but also the need for there to be a population of designers that can really develop a.
You are listening to Architects Abroad, a podcast for Brickworks Building Products. If you want to see any of the projects mentioned in this podcast, head to the gallery at the Brickworks YouTube channel. Obviously, you moved to Sydney. Any regrets leaving though at the time?
I think now that I'm here, I'm very happy to be here, and not that Sydney's far from Perth, really. I've not moved continents and and cultures, but look, it's always a thing to move away from family and close friends, but no, look, it's always an exciting thing to move from one place to another.
Yeah, this is a great city. Let's talk about the Australian Embassy in Bangkok and your role there and the experience. What was it like? Talk us through that project.
Well, that was really the reason why I came to Sydney and to begin with. So it's been a long journey being on the project. It was about let's say a 6-year journey, and that was one that was really quite focused. It wasn't many architects spend many years on buildings because buildings take a long time, as you well know, to be realised. But it's another thing to go from the beginning to the end of a project and not spend too much time on other projects.
They should say a lot about who we are. They should be these beacons of, Australian culture that sit somewhere, but they also, I suppose, how do you decide to find that balancing act that you want to land something somewhere that speaks of who we are, but you don't want to land something that doesn't fit, do you? What's the mindset? How do you work through that?
Well, I think it's probably worth starting by saying that the Australian government has a really laudable approach to the missions that they build overseas. There's an attitude to and a belief that the design of these is important to our presence in different countries in a way that I don't think we actually have here. I don't think that there is Australian government buildings have necessarily as much awareness of the importance.
I think they were. You look at, say, Australia House in London, and I think we decided as a nation to pour our money into that before our own Parliament House. So you start with that as that's 100 years ago, but that remains. Those things become, well, we need to show the world, or we need to show them. We need to show England that we're a sophisticated place at our own house. But certainly you see it with Sidler's Paris Embassy, these incredible buildings, and what's going on with the new one in Washington as well, and the one before that in Washington. These are important buildings.
And in the same, for us, the legacy of the Angkor Morlock Woori Embassy in Bangkok was one that was, it had a presence, I should say. It's sadly gone now. That and a character that was recognised around the world, and certainly by so many Australians. How visited Bangkok is as a city.
Yeah.
It was when I arrived in 2014, it was the most visited city in the world at that time, and just the extraordinary number of tourists moving through it. So it is a real challenge, and to find a language and to find a path to determine the means by which you express ideas of Australia in another place.
And how did you do it?
Well, again, I won't answer any of these questions directly. This project was preceded by a competition, so it was an Australian competition that BBN had won prior to my involvement in the project. By the time that in itself had a gestation period, and by the time we started to engage with the with the user groups and the stakeholders in Bangkok, it became quite apparent that the design that had won the competition was not necessarily what would be suitable for the users, and so Canberra and Bangkok had quite different views, and within the period that even occurred, 4 to 5 years is a long time in government. There's a lot of philosophical changes.
And what about the role in with bricks in the project? How did that come about?
Talking about how you find a character how you talk about a country and a place is not easy, and particularly Australia is not a place we can talk about as a single line, nor can you talk about any country. But we were wanting to find qualities that could be reflective and identifiable of Australia, and of ideas of place and country. And as we were exploring these ideas, we were also doing a similar thing with Thai buildings. And as you visit this extraordinary country, you start to learn things that you didn't know. And so part of the evolution of the design from the competition scheme came from our visiting Bangkok over numerous months. And you start to see the materials that are present in the country. And one of those that we discovered was they have there's two products. One is called laterite, and laterite is a very, very porous stone, and they basically make this stone by it's almost clay essentially that they cut when it's still wet and then dry it out, and as all the water evaporates, then becomes this very porous but very hard material that is used for building. And then the other product they use, and they use it extensively in contemporary buildings and in ancient buildings, is these baked clay bricks. And they've got this beautiful soft pink colour, but they have very little stability, and they're not highly regulated in the ways they're built. And so as we started to explore that material and how we could possibly use it, we started to reflect on our own built heritage, and we started we took some of these bricks from our visits in Bangkok and brought them back here, and started to wonder, well, how can we start getting our own industry involved, because that's obviously a big part of what we were doing is representing Australia, but how that actually talked to our own built heritage. And our European heritage has clay bricks are a fundamental part of that.
But I mean, going back to that example of Australia House 100 years ago, where they put all the timber and everything on the boats to make the building, how much is there an expectation, or is it a desire to have within yourselves that you'll have some materials that are from Australia or represent Australia in that way?
That was a very, very important part of the design. I think that it was more an aspiration, but it was interesting on reflection how it became extremely intuitive. I think that the building itself is, as an organic form, is not necessarily representative of Australia. I mean, there's the obvious references to Uluru, which certainly not ones that we were, aiming as a direct reference. But what became really interesting when the material started to be revealed through the building was how people would say, "Oh, it just feels Australian," and I'm quite sure it was the particularly the honey colour of the black butt that we were using, we were using some red stones from the Pilbara region that were some marble that had a really had a sense of Australia, which it was hard to explain in any other ways other than it was an intuitive connection that was really gratifying to see people identifying.
And the process of living there, tell us about how long you were there and what it was like.
So I was there for 3.5 years. So literally from the test pile going into the ground to the keys being handed over and the last commissioning certificates being signed. So it was a real journey of, it was a journey of learning for me in so many ways. But it was, I think the experience was very uniquely Thai in a way that that even to sort of use, that as a description is something that, really it unveils itself over time, because as a country, as a Buddhist country, it's a very, very different place. It's a very different culture to Australia in ways that I didn't and I couldn't have understood. But it was also an extremely international experience. I was just counting on before I came here, I was counting how many nationalities were working within our project team, because we had a French-Thai contractor building the building, and we had 15 different nationalities working just within our project group, and it was a largely Australian project team from the government side and from BBN, but the expanse of expertise.
So this is where you tell me it was an absolute disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Well,
it was bloody. We were trying to get something done. They didn't want to do it.
There were moments like that, but it was as I said, it was a French predominantly. It was a company called Bouygues, they had their Thai base was called Bouygues Thai, but they had a number of French contractors and then French and Spanish and English, but they were incredibly ambitious in the way that they took this project on. They saw the opportunities in developing their own skills and doing what we were wanting to do, which was effectively to build an Australian building in Thailand. It wasn't a matter of us building a Thai building. It was saying, right, we are going to, build an Australian building to codes and requirements and regulations in Thailand, and that is not to be underestimated.
But I've just got to get the Aussie regulations in there as well. I mean, that 3.5 years later, and you're there. There's the opening ceremony. Who were the dignitaries that were there for it?
Well, Julie Bishop let the turtle out into the pond.
Is that a euphemism?
The importance of it was one that could only be understood by the people who really thought this up. But,
let's get past the dignitaries. I mean, that's 3.5 years of your life. It's a significant amount of time. Living overseas, working on a project from start to finish. What did it feel like?
I think as an architect, the experience of I shouldn't speak for everyone, but the experience of finishing a building is one that is very bittersweet. I don't think that there's ever you never will have the perspective that other people have of a completed building. You see all its flaws, and all of the history of something is one that you can't take away from your knowledge of the building. So I think that you have to accept the platitudes that that you receive and the excitement that other people have about a building, to really take something away from it, because as I said, your experience and your knowledge through that whole delivery is really a construction site, and the completion is a reasonably small part of that. And the most satisfying part for me of the completed building was returning every 3 months for the defects periods and seeing how the users were settling in and using the building, because on day one it's very hard. People can, they're excited, but they've just
let a turtle out.
They've let a turtle out, but they've also moved out of a building that they've been in for 20 years, 25 years, and it's quite traumatic.
So every time you go back, someone else has put some sort of laminated piece of
Absolutely,
paper up over something
absolutely.
pretty, and you go, oh, I don't think that was the chair that we specified. Ooh.
And that's a real lesson for architects, I think. You know, you do need to be aware of how people inhabit buildings. You know, and partly the lesson is, you know, learn to let go. You know, we all love to reflect on the photographs that, you know, that are perfectly highly curated, that we can all remember something by. But actually seeing how people use it and it starts to evolve, because it does immediately as soon as you finish it. And so the less that it is yours, in the sense that you've been on site day by day, and the more that it is somebody else's, is where I think the satisfaction comes.
I love that. It's beautifully put. Well, the final question I have for you is that, you know, both the experiences of studying overseas and then working overseas, how has it affected how you work here and your view, your worldview?
I think I'm laughing because I think one of the first experiences I had overseas, or one of the revelations that I had, was that while I spoke a universal, you know, I mean, English as a language, we're very fortunate as Australian travellers to be able to communicate with so many people. But you realise pretty quickly that people don't always understand Australians. and it's something that I really had to reflect on, to speak slowly and clearly, and to find ways of communicating that was acknowledged the fact that I only spoke one language and everyone else, you know, spoke many. And that, you know, to sort of extrapolate that to the experience of working and studying overseas, was that you just learn how valuable communication is. And, you know, when you're in an environment where you're dealing with, you know, 4 different nationalities, and they've all got wonderful different experiences and all got things to bring to a project, the more that you can draw those things together and listen to people and make yourself understood, the better it is, the more enjoyable the experience is, but also the more fruitful the working environment that you're in is.
That makes a lot of sense. I like that a lot because, you know, being someone who's bamboozled people with some of the things that I've said, I'm sending that thing where you send an email to someone in London and then you're waiting, you know, sometimes a day to get a reply. And one particular email was, you know, someone said, have you been busy or something? And I was just replied, yeah, I've been flat chat. And not for a moment did I. And they spent the whole time trying to work out. It's like, what's flat chat?
Or telling someone you're meeting them in the Arvo.
Yeah.
And then they spend 3 hours, you know, deeply questioning.
Yeah. I'm just getting a sango. What? You got another big project, and one that I think will change the city, and a very important projects, the fish markets in Sydney. How's that shaping up?
It's been a really wonderful experience.
Where do you put the pelicans? That's important.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, you know, the conversations, again, you know, you just add another weird set of requirements and complexities to the toolkit that you'll never use again. You know, so those requirements that you learn of, you know, what happens if dead pelican, you know, blocks up the drains and X and Y and Z.
They're pretty full on, the pelicans.
They are. Oh, that's right. It's been a really fabulous project to work on, and to delve so deeply into it has been great. You know, and there's the Danish connection there for me. So that's been.
What's going to knock people's socks off about it?
Oh, the way that one of the main requirements of the brief, and this came out of the competition, was how do you integrate a public realm with the light industrial facility? And then that's a huge challenge. And as you say, the fish and the smells and the water and everything else.
With fish guts.
It's a big problem, and I think that the design that we have is a great solution. So and not only is it a great solution, but the urban growth, who became Infrastructure New South Wales, have been great stewards of the design and seeing that an outcome that the ambition was set early, but where it is now and going into the next phase of its life, where it meets the tenderers and then starts to become a reality is one where we've seen the design intent really be manifested in a set of documents, which we're really proud about.
I'm looking forward to it, and then it's a brand new
I think you're going to miss the car park with all the fish guts.
Mate, really good to chat. Thank you so much, and good luck with it. And I look forward to seeing your career evolve. All the best.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
You've been listening to Architects Abroad, which is a podcast series presented by Brickworks Building Products. If you'd like to see any of the projects mentioned in this podcast, head to the gallery at the Brickworks YouTube channel. I'm Tim Ross. Thanks so much for listening.